first thing that I bet you didn't know about JavaScript. Let's dive right in. So today I found this website, a pretty cool website. You must have seen it before. This is called javascript.info. It's a pretty nifty website that has everything that you ever would want to learn about JavaScript. And looking at it, it says the modern JavaScript tutorial, and it has, oh my God, 16,763 GitHub stars. That's a pretty big deal in the developer community, isn't it? You can also buy the EPUB or the PDF version, which would have all of this in a book format that you can consume. But today, we have visited the website to uncover some of the secrets of JavaScript. Although you may find those in the MDN websites or the official JavaScript websites, this particular website puts it very simply, and the concepts that are distilled here are really, really amazing. So let's look at the very first one. I bet if you go to the JavaScript fundamentals section here, you may think you know all of them, but we'll get to them in a second. What I want to talk about is when you get into the data type section, this is one of the very important sections in any programming language, right? So if you want to understand the methods of primitives, if we click on methods of primitives, we would know that JavaScript already has 7 primitive data types, right? So data types are nothing but the types of variables that you can create within a programming language, and in JavaScript it allows you to create string, number, big int, boolean, symbol, null, undefined. These are some of the interesting ones, but these are some of the standard ones that you may have looked at in other languages as well: string, number, big int, boolean, and symbol. Now these are the primitive data types, right? So whenever you create a string, you just create a string and that gets stored as a variable in the memory. But there's one other specialty about JavaScript that we all know, and that are objects. You can create an object and store multiple things within the object as key value pairs. This is something similar to the dictionary in Python, or hash maps or hash sets in Java. So an object is capable of storing multiple values as properties. So you can create an object, as we all know, using an open curly bracket, closed curly bracket, and then it has key value pairs in it. One additional cool thing that we already know about JavaScript is that you can embed functions as properties within an object. So if you create a John object, you can create a key. The key has to be string. However, the value can be a whole function in itself. And then once you add this function here, you can just call john.sayHi. It's going to execute this function and alert or print hi buddy. That's something very cool, right? But we already knew it. What we don't know, or that I'm hoping you don't know yet, is that this property here is something very intrinsic to JavaScript. Like storing functions as properties with an object is something very intrinsic to the JavaScript, and to the JavaScript language specifically. And the developer of the JavaScript really did a good job of going through this paradox of having primitive data types, like the strings, numbers, big int, but also having functions that we can call using these primitive data types. Let's see what I'm talking about. So a primitive is an object. So in JavaScript, let's assume you create a string right here. And since JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, you are not specifying the data type while creating the variable. However, the value you assign to it determines its type. So in this case, we have assigned a string, which is hello, and that determines that this str variable is going to be of type string. But string is a primitive type, right? So whenever you create a variable, that variable gets stored into the memory just like a normal variable, but not like an object. However, when you do str.toUppercase, that is a very standard thing to do in JavaScript. Whenever you want to convert a string to all uppercase letters, you call str.toUppercase and you get a string with all capital letters, right? Well, have you ever noticed that str being a primitive data type, how are you able to call toUppercase? Well, that's a mystery by itself, right? In strongly typed languages like Java, you cannot call a function on a variable alone. If you have defined something like a string, right, and in Java, you will have to use a string keyword to define the string first. But then secondly, you would have to use something like string util and then call something like string.toUpper or something like that, which is embedded within the string util collection. And then you'd have to pass this string variable reference, and that would give you a new string. JavaScript has removed all that hassle, and that lets you just call functions on primitive types. Looking at this line and comparing it to the previous object line that we did, it's pretty similar, right? The only difference here being John here is an object because it holds a value that looks like an object, and str here is a string because it holds a value that looks like a string. But then you're able to do this. Where did you define toUppercase? Or is JavaScript doing it behind the hood? Yes, it is doing behind the scenes. Now let's see how it's doing it. When you create a variable, it does not use any additional memory. However, when you call toUpper, so in the moment of accessing the property toUpper, a special object is created that knows the value of the string and has useful methods like toUppercase, toLowercase, and so on. And this method runs and returns a new string. So remember, when you are passing this, when you're calling this function on the string, it actually creates a copy of the string, converts it into uppercase, and returns it. So you are basically using twice the amount of memory that the original string variable was using while calling this. But that's not a big deal. The big deal is the special object that gets created when you call this gets destroyed once the execution is complete. So once this line has returned a new string to us, the object gets destroyed. However, the string's memory reference still exists. That's a pretty cool feature in JavaScript, isn't it? There's one last thing that I want to touch about primitives being objects. Now, we can say that primitives are objects in JavaScript. However, that's just for JavaScript and JavaScript to keep. That's not for the users to interface with. Now, what do I mean, right? So, what do I mean is the constructors in JavaScript, like the number that start with the uppercase letter n and the boolean and similar string, they are all constructors in JavaScript, right? And whenever you call a new number one, it creates a new number object, and then it sets the value of the number equal to 1. But because there's an object, you would get confused when you try to use it in if statements, because if object, in this case new number here, holds in whole object in 0, and when you check if 0 is going to return true every time, even though the value within it is 0. Now in JavaScript, if 0 is going to return false, right? However, if we pass in this whole object with an if, it's always going to equate to true. And so using objects is very lethal in JavaScript, and it's a very risky way of using it. However, you can use constructors on their own to convert string to numbers or booleans and so on, integers to boolean and so on. Let's look at this example here. We have num equals number. So this is again a constructor, but notice that we have removed the new keyword before it. So it's not going to initialize a new object. However, it is going to use this constructor and return us a integer value instead. Well, this is all that I wanted to discuss in this video, and I hope this was insightful. And you can go to this website and take a look at it on your own. You can take a look at other concepts. And now let's see what's the second thing that you may have missed about JavaScript. Now, the second thing that I wanted to talk about today that you may not know about JavaScript is this introduction of strict mode. Now, you may have seen it in a couple of websites or in the scripts that you have been perusing, or maybe you ever wanted to use script so that you can have backwards compatibility with the previous scripts that you may have written a couple of years ago, but you never kind of knew what it does and when was it introduced and the history behind it. So let's look at it. I'm again at the JavaScript info website here, and now we have moved into the JavaScript fundamental section, and within the section there's a section called modern mode use strict. Now, for a long time, JavaScript evolved without compatibility issues, right? New features were added to the language while old functionality did not change. But after the ECMAScript 5, which is ES5, that's about 2009, 2010, after that, it added new features to the language and modified some of the existing ones. So what happened with that part here is when you modify something that's old, and also all the websites that have been using those old features will have to look for backwards compatibility, right? So to keep the old code working, most such modifications that were made after ES5 are off by default. So any modification made to the previous features of JavaScript before 2009 would be off by default, but you can enable them explicitly by using the directive in JavaScript called use strict. All right, that's all it is. So if you have ever used piece of code in JavaScript, if you have ever written a piece of code in JavaScript and you have written it when it was in 2009 or 2010, you can kind of make sure that the old code still works, right? By making sure that you do not include use strict, but you include use strict, it will make sure that those changes come into effect and your old code starts acting like your new code. One good example here is if you use this directive on the very top of your script file, it's going to apply for the whole script file, but the directive itself is scoped. So you can either mention it at the very top of the script file, but if you only want to use strict within a function or within a module, you can do that after the function. So if you create a function right here after the alert function and you pass in all the code below it, it's going to adhere to the use strict directive. However, all the code before it is not going to do that. So this is kind of scoped that you can use. So let's try to do this nifty thing right here. I have opened up the Node.js compiler online, and we have this use strict directive defined up top, which means it's going to be applied for all the lines going forward. Now I have also created a character variable, and then I have decided to give it an object. And inside an object, we only have one key, which is John. Now there are two ways that we can make sure that this code fails, right? One way is to call some unknown property of character, which char, which was never defined. So in this case, char.age, which was never defined in the object, this would just be undefined. So this is not going to cause an error. However, this age that you see here is not initialized anywhere, right? So this age is not declared anywhere. If you want to declare a variable, you either have to say let age, or you have to do const age, and so on. But we have not done that here. So in this case, if you remove the use strict and you run this code, nothing's going to happen, right? Because in JavaScript, the way they changed the variable initialization and made it a mandatory step was after the ES5 or the ECMAScript 5 right here. But if you go back to your original code and you uncomment your use strict and then you run your code, it's going to fail. It's going to fail saying reference error, age is not defined yet. Now, a neat way to put it would be just to put it under try block, and let's see what happens. Try catch, and then catch will catch the error, and then we'll just console log the error to see what it is, and then let's move this inside the try block. And what do you think would happen in this case when we run this code? You guessed it right, we would get the reference error again, because the use strict derivative scope does not change even if we encapsulate this line within try catch block. However, if I remove it and then add it after this line, let's see what happens here. There's no error. But if you, and the reason is that this only works for scopes for below this line. Well, this was about use strict, and you can use strict. You can use this very nifty derivative wherever you found that you have an old script lying around and you want to reuse it with your new web page on a new or old browser. You can go ahead and do that. Now let's look at a third thing that I think you don't know about JavaScript yet. Moving on to the third feature that I hope you didn't know about JavaScript yet. And again, we are at this JavaScript info webpage, and I was going through these advanced working with functions section here, and they have pretty cool feature outlined there, and I feel that I have never used it on my own before, and it is the new function syntax. Now, we already know something about functions in JavaScript, right? The way we define a function, the way we call a function, and then the way we pass parameters to that function, right? JavaScript is a very functional programming language, and everything is about functions. You create a function, you pass the function from one function to another. You can create nested functions, and you can embed functions within objects. You can use different objects for different functions. You can use closures and so on. But then this very unique feature within JavaScript is very rarely used, but sometimes there's no alternative, right? Imagine a situation where you wanted to kind of convert a piece of string into a functional piece of code. Imagine something like having a mathematical formula and trying to convert it into a function, right? And you don't want to sit there and write a function using the normal function syntax in JavaScript, which is something like doing a function and then do a metric math and then passing in this variables and then writing this function, and then you have to then store this function somewhere. And then, as we already know in JavaScript, whenever you create a function, a new environment object for that function gets created, right? And that takes care of how the variables are accessed and how the variables are scoped within the function and outside the function. For example, if I have a let a equals 0 here, right, we know that the let will only allow this function to use a, and nothing outside of the function can use this. But this particular function can also use outer variables, right? This function can use something like let a here or let b equals 0. This function can access let b here as well, right? So the way it's able to do it is when you create this function, JavaScript behind the scenes creates a environment object, and that object is nothing but a way for JavaScript to keep track of functions, its variables, and the outer scope variables that it can access. And so think about not having to write all of this on your own and then storing this function somewhere in a script file or module file and then importing it, exporting it, and so on. What if I just gave you a string and I said a return a times 2 or something like that, for a very primitive example here? How do you convert it into a function, right? If you give it to someone who already knows JavaScript, they would go on and they would quickly start writing something like this, right? Function and blah, blah, blah. And then they'll be like return and then a multiplier and so on. And then they'll pass in a, and then they'll do all kinds of things and then return a times 2, right? This is what they'll do. But this new cool feature that I'm talking about today is called the new function. Well, this is not a new cool feature of JavaScript. This is something that already existed, but people rarely use it. And the concept is very simple, right? The syntax for creating a function using the new keyword before the function keyword is something like this. You declare a variable and then you initialize it with new function. And then for new function, you pass in a list of arguments, right? And then you pass in the function body. Now, the whole trick lies in how you pass these arguments and the function body itself. For example, look at this line. It says that let sum equals new function, passing in a and b and returning a plus b. Now notice how this is just a string and not a normal JavaScript syntax. But then when you call sum using obviously the open parenthesis and closed parentheses and pass the two arguments 1 and 2, you're able to get the output exactly as you want it to be. Isn't that really cool? Let's look further, right? There are more examples here. So let say hi equals new function alert hello. Now this is going to alert hello. You just have to call say hi instead of doing alert hello everywhere, right? So imagine having a bunch of these defined in your website, and every time you can use a friendly name for a function instead of having to write alert hello. You can just say hi, and say hi would always say hello. Right? So nifty and useful. And then there's one other difference in terms of how you can create these functions this way, and that is, if you go back, I'm just going to skip the closure part right here because I think most of us already know what closures are. In summary, you can create functions with this new keyword and then using this function constructor declaration, and then you can pass in the arguments. This is where the magic lies, right? You can pass in arguments individually as individual string literals, or you can pass it in as a single string with the characters separated by comma symbol, or well, you can do the whole thing like this as well with spaces, comma separated with spaces. Everything that you pass in here gets accepted as an argument within the function, and then anything you pass in the string should at least be some mathematical operation or should do something that JavaScript already does. So you cannot put in some random word here and expect it to work. So but then this is so useful, right? Imagine you just had a string somewhere in your server and then you wanted to inject it in your website directly for certain kinds of users and not 100% of the users. What would you initially do, right? You would create a new function, you will deploy it in the front end. Imagine you just had a string in the back end and you pass it to the front end, and then your front end client is just able to convert that string into a function with a single line like this. So cool.